Okay, okay. May I have the profile there for Professor Alinah, please? So thank you everyone for your attention and being here. Our next session, our next keynote speech is on the role of government and NGOs in research development. And Professor Alinah Segobye is going to deliver the keynote speech to us. Professor Segobye is an extraordinary professor at Northwestern University and research scholar at the African Features Institute in South Africa. She was the former Dean of Faculty Human Science at the Namibia University of Science and Technology. She is a fellow of the African Academy of Science and serves on the African Union Commission's Champion for Arts, Culture and Heritage panel of experts. She earned both MPhil and PhD from the University of Cambridge, UK in archaeology. Thereafter, she has had several research fellowships, including visiting scholar at Humanities Research Centre, University of Canberra, Smuts Fund Visiting Research Fellow at the Department of Archaeology, University of Cambridge, Fellow of Wolfson College, University of Cambridge, Senior Research Fellow at the University of Bradford, UK, Visiting Scholar, Mellon Foundation Research Grant, Stanford University, US, Senior Research Fellow, University of South Africa, Honorary Associate Professor at Thabo Mbeki Leadership Institute, University of South Africa, Fulbright Scholarship, Senior Research Fellow at Sociology Department and Center for African Studies, UC Berkeley in the US, and currently Associate Senior Researcher, African Features Institute, Pretoria, South Africa. She has served as the Deputy Executive Director, Research Human Science Research Council, Pretoria, South Africa, Senior Consultant, African Comprehensive Partnership for HIV/AIDS, Senior Lecturer and Associate Professor at University of Botswana, Vice President and President, Pan-African Association of Archaeology and Related Studies, Deputy Chairperson, Delta's Program Selection Committee, African Academy of Science 2020, member of the African Union Champions Task Group on Art, Culture and Heritage, Chairperson Program Committee, African Academy of Science. Currently, she serves in the board of several national, continental, and international organizations. She is also in the editorial board of several journals in her area of research interest. She has teaching, research, and consultants experience in African studies, including on archaeology, culture and heritage management, HIV/AIDS, gender, and development. She has authored several essay and book chapters on African development. Since 2021, she serves as the chairperson of Science for African Foundation. Dear ladies and gentlemen, please join me to welcome Professor Alinah Segobye. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you for the very warm introduction. Makes me feel a bit like an imposter, but there we are. Thank you to the organizers for this wonderful session. I apologize because I've not been able to join the discussions for the last 2 days. I was in another conference elsewhere, so I was physically traveling, so I could not join. Be it as it may, I'm grateful for this topic, especially because it speaks to a lot of what is at I think close to my heart as a researcher and as I'd say research manager or leader. Yeah, where to start? I think my bio has just been read, maybe highlight some of those areas that are close to what I do, what I've done, and where I see the intersections between government, especially government on the continent of Africa, and also of non-state actors, so what we call NGOs and POs and civic society, but also importantly of private sectors across the continent. And I think my presentation or speech will reflect on those intersections. I think where we are right now, which is an exciting moment for the African continent, is an area where many of us in the academy who are sort of the more senior practitioners find as a moment of excitement, and perhaps sometimes some may see it as a moment of anticipation in terms of where we are going to and where we're coming from in respect to science, society, and policy issues. Maybe to start unpacking some of the concepts of the issue of government. I think most times when we speak of government, people talk about state and state apparatuses in terms of those who are in office, in this instance, political office leaders who are elected via democratic election processes, and then discharge the functions of government. But I think others would also see government as, of course, much more inclusive of all actors, including non-state actors. And this includes the private sector, civic society, and oftentimes what we call NGOs. And I think, in my view, NGOs should be also unpacked a little bit further to speak to all actors in that rubric, which may include, for example, community-based organizations and actors, religious and non-religious or traditional and otherwise belief systems in informed organizations, what oftentimes is called faith-based organizations. And also, of course, the international arena, which has international development partners, or what has traditionally, conventionally been called donor partners. So all of these actors are critical in when we look at the issue of government and civic society interactions, especially when you come from the point of research. Likewise, the concept of research, I'm sure you've discussed the last 2 days, what is the meaning of research, its breadth, depth, etc. But from where I'm contextualizing it, research for me will speak to the very basic work that is done, whether at individual, community, or research organization, institutional level, including, of course, broadly what government would do in terms of enabling there to be knowledge resources that will be utilized in the course of development. So research, whether it's basic, applied, blue sky, whatever form, shape, is critical to the conversation we're having, because the sole purpose of having that knowledge or information and data sets is so that they can become usable products in solving societal problems. And these may be development challenges. And I think across the continent of Africa, we are familiar with our broad range of issues that face us in terms of development. So for me, in this case, the issue of the nexus or the interface between government and research and non-government organization will principally be framed around this issue of what is the role of all actors, including NGOs, in discharging this research mandate. And I think critically, the question is, why should there be a responsibility or a relationship? And I think it is important that, as I said earlier, we are looking at why. The why is that research is meant to address critical problems that are there in society and deliver solutions as they may be seen. However, oftentimes the question is, what solutions would then be needed in that respect, and what are the deliverables? And of course, most times we're looking at products or tangible products. In this instance, most of us will see this research products as, for example, publications from scholarly works, patents, and other such products, or oftentimes the industrial products of what would have been the process of developing something tangible like products. But importantly too are the knowledge products, which are the intangibles that may be there, that may reside in I'd say, conventional forms. And this is where I'm coming from in terms of why it is important that not-for-profit organizations have a relationship with government in the landscape or ecosystem of research. And in this regard, you find that oftentimes it's the most vulnerable of our community, society, that oftentimes need this relationship to be there. Now, first and foremost, from the topic that I was given, looking at this role of government, I think government is critical, and I think most likely it has been touched on, government, in whatever form or shapes, first responsibility is to create the enabling environment and then to provide the leadership that will then make sure that enabling environment is resourced. So the enabling environment in the main, we're looking at the legal frameworks or the legislative tools that would be there through acts of parliament and any other enacted bodies of legislation that will ensure that doing research is got all the right regulatory and platforms. But secondly, of course, it has to happen in an organized manner. In this regard, oftentimes we rely on planning systems. Most of our countries are going to have plans which are 5-year plans, development plans, annual plans that are going to ensure that the course of the development of research and its products is happening in a context, which context is driven or informed by resources. And in this regard, government also will have that critical responsibility of ensuring that there are resources. In the main, 3 kinds of resources are critical. This is going to be your financial resources, and then your human capital resources, what you call human capital, resources. The third one, of course, is going to be the infrastructure. And I think across the African continent, most of us are aware of perhaps this deficit that has been highlighted over the last couple of decades post-independence in terms of our institutional infrastructural resources. Most institutions that do research, most likely higher education institutions, including research councils, oftentimes face a huge challenge in terms of having the right infrastructure that will enable scientists or researchers to do the work they need to do to deliver the products they need to do or that they really want to do. So it has become very critical that as we look at this nexus of the availability of resources, we also critique what is it that should be the right and appropriate infrastructure that is in this environment that will ensure that our best researchers get the best resources, ensure that their best ideas come to the best products that can meet the needs of society. And I think looking at, for example, the just recently hugely global challenges, the COVID pandemic and an ongoing, of course, climate crises, we realize that across the continent of Africa, we do have challenges in those two. With the COVID pandemic, for example, one of the biggest lessons that we learned was that our health systems were not fit for purpose in terms of producing the timely results to ensure that whether it is access to prevention or treatment or any other knowledge, information was available for the citizenry of the continent. So our eyes, of course, as usual, turned to the Western world to look for support in terms of monetary or otherwise technical expertise, scientific expertise. However, we also learned very big lessons during the pandemic, and that was amongst the most critical, was that actually most of our research infrastructure across the continent, despite having limitations, actually had the potential and capital, human resource and otherwise, to deliver on some of the most basic. And that comes to the issue of innovation. A lot of the innovation that was done was very basic, but delivered what was needed, whether it was in the form of ensuring the safeguarding of communities at household level, at individual level, but also in terms of ensuring the sharing and caring, I'd say, spirit that was necessary to ensure the protection of communities where such measures were necessary. In respect to the enabling infrastructure, we also see this critical importance of not only having the infrastructure insofar as we're looking at buildings and other such technology-driven products that should be there to drive the research, but also I'll say the architecture of the systems and processes that ensure that research takes place, not only in state, but interstate and intrastate. In other words, we've seen more recently with the, I'd say, growing partnerships that are coming in between states, across our states, the development of tools and systems that ensure that we are not only working in state, but also across our states, whether it's through the mechanisms of the regional economic communities, the RECs, or also through other kinds of partnerships and conglomerates that are there across the continent. And here one can cite the example of what has become very critical as the academies of sciences across the African continent. There are the national academies and there are the regional academies, and of course the African Academy of Sciences, which have created the platforms to ensure that cooperation for research can be done across the borders of nation states. In terms of the financial resources, we've seen government commitments across the continent also not meet what would be the current, I'd say, goal settings that have been done. In many instances, we hope that we would get to a 1% of the GDP of countries as the research spend. Unfortunately, most countries across the continent, perhaps even globally, have not been able to make that mark. So the question is, where and how do we get the extra resourcing for research? And this is where the private sector becomes a key partner in terms of the research ecosystem. However, I believe that we also should not undermine the capacity of the not-for-profit sector, in this case, civic society, institutions, which also are in this triangle of relationships of government, non-state actors, and private sectors, because therein lies the critical resource, the human capital, where research gets done, where research products can also be oftentimes tested. We know, for example, that with clinical science research, most trials are done on populations across our communities. Oftentimes, well, increasingly so, this is done with their consent, but in the past, as you know, the history of a continent, most of this early research was done without the consent of communities or individuals. But now increasingly with the, I'd say, more ethical approach to scientific research, we're seeing the engagement with communities being a partnership for co-production of knowledge and knowledge products. So in this regard, civic society and the organizational structures, whether it's CBOs, FBOs that govern them, are critical for ensuring that the people who are going to be part and parcel of research are also key in the decision making. And these are some of the lessons we've learned again through our crises, for example, the HIV/AIDS pandemic and the malaria, of course, challenges in malaria that are ongoing. The clinical trials, the search for treatment, the search for cures, oftentimes had to lead to uncomfortable issues, especially in the biomedical fields, in terms of the ethics of doing scientific research, where people had to consent to doing perhaps research that is done on their bodies, oftentimes putting them at great risk, whether it was physiological or otherwise, they're standing in society. So we've seen great leaps and bounds in terms of the development of the protocols, the means through which people engage in terms of research ecosystems to ensure that communities are able and individuals to take full ownership and be co-producers of knowledge in a truly meaningful way. Now, we also have seen the increased diversification of roles at government level in terms of where and how the enabling environment decision making happens. As I said earlier, critically is the legislation, the plans, the policy frameworks, the implementation plans, and that are critical. But we've also seen in terms of government, I'd say the ecosystem of government, also the diversification, where in the traditional governance systems, government would be all those government departments through ministries, departments that did the work. Increasingly, we see government devolving some of that responsibility to other entities. I, for example, now sit in a state-owned enterprise that is charged with doing policy advisory and research for human capital development in Botswana. Previously, I've worked in similar kind of organization in South Africa, the Human Science Research Council, which also had the similar mandate of advising government on policy areas around human social development issues and also public health. So we see this devolution, which is decentralization, which is critical to an enabling environment that governments also have done to make sure that whatever is being done in terms of research, the governance structures enable there to be mechanisms that cascade more towards an inclusive approach as opposed to the traditional hierarchical approach where government is a know-it-all and there's a bottom-up, rather there's a top-down trickling of information and resources. Now we see a much more, I'd say, decentralized, but also a bottom-up or middle-up, a much more flattened structure of government approach to how we do this. This has been very important in the course of the development of the science research landscape across the continent. And I'm speaking very generally, I must say, because time will not permit me to go into greater detail in here. But I'm more than happy to continue engaging afterwards around some of these issues. But we've seen government across the continent be in a position to decentralize and give more decision-making and authority over research to not only SOEs, but to privately run think tanks, institutional mechanisms, including individuals who become key thought leaders in society. We've also seen the development of much more active participation of philanthropic organizations, including, of course, the non-state actors of an international kind. We've seen international philanthropic organizations become more active in engaging even to community-based research across our societies. And one such example has been in the tackling of the malaria and Ebola challenges that have plagued the continent. We've seen a much more inclusive approach to ensuring that even the accountability for resources, finances especially, it's much more in, I would say, participatory in how the planning, the resource distribution, accounting for such resources has been, which has been quite an exciting development given the traditional mechanisms that maybe were perhaps known to government throughout our continent. We've also seen a convergence of roles where even in terms of the, I'd say, the legislative decision making, there's been much more participatory approach. And an area that one can cite is in the manner, especially during the HIV pandemic, where government was much more receptive to embracing non-traditional mechanisms of, I'd say, scientific exploration and scientific partnerships. If one looks at the 2000s or the decade of the 2000s, at the height of the HIV pandemic, it was quite clear that solutions which in the past and traditionally had been bestowed upon, for example, biomedical experts, were now much more accepted to be also finding solutions emerging from communities. And this came in the form of, for example, exploration of a traditional medical resource and knowledge, the more inclusive approach towards the caretaking and the comprehensive care and support for communities or with communities in respect to prevention, treatment, and care in HIV/AIDS. And this has led to a huge multiplication of innovations that have emerged since, not only innovations in terms of medical know-how and technologies, but also systems and processes that have strengthened our health systems insofar as giving care and support in communities. And this was critical. I believe there's literature to support this too, when we now came to the COVID pandemic, in that we did not really need to invent the wheel insofar as what kind of institutional care support systems need to happen. Some of those gaps that were experienced in the HIV, at the height of the HIV pandemic, were at least mitigated when we came to the COVID pandemic. And one key area that is perhaps worth highlighting is the protection of women and girls in terms of their vulnerability in a household and community-based spaces. With the pandemic, it was quite clear that HIV pandemic, the burden of care and support fell on women and children in communities. And this had a huge impact on, for example, education for the girl child. With interventions and programmatic interventions across the last 2 decades, we've seen a huge improvement in keeping young girls in school, ensuring that they become better enabled and with life skills and other resources, we're able to see through their training and are now much better actors in society in terms of becoming, household support systems, better income, etc., etc. Now, with the COVID pandemic, short-lived as it was, we are aware of the decimating impact it had also on households in this respect. But because we already had foreknowledge of what would have happened at the beginning of the HIV/AIDS pandemic, it was much, much better in respect to protecting the most vulnerable in society, including young girls. It did not stop all the atrocities that might have happened, but it did go a long way. So, in other words, these learned experiences from communities were critical in shaping policy that the uptake of which government has utilized in government policy decision making and implementation, which is where this nexus that I spoke to earlier is critical. Now, coming to this issue of how is it and why is it critical that government continues to embrace a role for non-state actors, not-for-profit organizations in decision making? It is critical because I think all of us are, would say without thinking twice that it's critical that as citizens, whether we are citizens who are the leadership of science or citizens who are leadership in communities, or citizens who are in any standing at all in society, it's critical that government sees a level of ownership that goes beyond just the electoral process in society. So it is in this regard that communities become critical and NPOs become critical in ensuring that there's evidence-based policy making. And that evidence comes principally from research. That research, as I said, comes principally from communities. We as scientists can only do so much to ensure that when we say there's informed development processes, we've got the right research instruments that are quality assured, we've got the right advisory and knowledge from science that is well informed and tested, that can then be given to government to ensure that those decisions are owned throughout. So in other words, the democratization of the spaces for science that we oversee also must be known to and owned by the communities from whom such knowledge is coming from. And that is where this nexus is critical for me. I'll just give an example of some of the initiatives that have been done, which were highlighted earlier. As a fellow of the African Academy of Sciences and as someone who's been in the governance structures of the AAS, it's become quite clear that, for example, across the African continent, we create the environment that supports research scientists and all the, I'd say, diverse infrastructure, including resources that they work with. What we've learned, including now as an active member of the Science Foundation for Africa, what we've learned is that the continent has great talent in terms of scientific capabilities and leadership. What oftentimes we're lacking were those institutional resources, infrastructure, human capital, and finances to drive those ideas to realization. With smart partnerships that have been enabled by independent international financing agencies, in this instance, we look at, for example, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Wellcome Trust, Carnegie Foundation, among others. Scientists across the continent have been able to do some of the most cutting-edge research in and with communities and have been able to deliver some of the most impactful solutions for some of the most challenging development issues, especially in the area of public health. And these are critical in ensuring that the future of our societies can be safeguarded through homegrown research, know-how, and technologies. If one looks at the recent developments in the area of malaria treatment, the search for a cure in malaria treatment has become much more, I'd say, exciting for those scientists working in that space with the increased advances in finding through clinical trials things that work. Likewise, the knowledge we've garnered so far in the treatment, for example, of HPVs and cancers that affect women. We've learned so much about the development of vaccines that, for example, can be administered in the prevention of HPV, so that the life and well-being of young girls and women who become mothers is better safeguarded to prevent cancers, especially cervical cancer. These are things that oftentimes we may take perhaps for granted because we assume that somebody somewhere is doing this work and those vaccines we take as a given. But like I said earlier, the COVID pandemic and the extreme, I'd say, traumatic experience that was learned in terms of the lack of vaccines to support whatever treatment and cure that might have happened was a learning lesson, a wake-up call in the need for the continent to develop its own capabilities. So we've seen, for example, across the continent, and especially I want to highlight the importance of the African Union Commission and its various institutional frameworks like the Center for Disease Control Africa. We've seen the acceleration of vaccine development. Some of those institutions, one can cite, for example, the Pasteur Institute in Senegal has gone a long way towards being at the front line of developing cutting-edge scientific, technical know-how and expertise in vaccines development. Likewise, across the rest of the continent, we've seen rapid acceleration in terms of the development of know-how, technology, and expertise in climate science research, which were things that we had outsourced to other parts of the world beforehand. But increasingly, these now become homegrown, home-based, and have ensured that there's a huge explosion of innovation across the African continent, which we sorely need. Because in terms of science, unfortunately, there's only so much we can outsource. The increased entrenchment of capacity and capability in the continent is critical for ensuring that the actual cost of scientific research becomes much more visible to our governments, so that increasing investment in science can be localized, can be done and budgeted for within our own public spend. Because the spend on R&D on the continent, like I said at the beginning, still remains minuscule when we compare with the need. And one of the key driving reasons for this is that, as most of you may be aware, the science, the overarching science tech innovation policy for Africa, TISA, will be coming to an end quite soon next year. So the African Union Commission is in the process of doing the consultative mechanisms for ensuring the second generation TISA will be coming into play. Now, this is a critical moment for us as science actors across the continent to ensure that we can galvanize at all levels, especially at community levels, the ownership of the voice and advocacy to ensure that the financing of science, research, and innovation across the entire continent is in sync. And this is why it is critical that platforms such as these that ASFI has provided are not only just an engagement of scientists and like-minded, peers, but become platforms through which the voice of communities can become amplified and become much more visible and heard, not just within national borders, but countries and also across the world. And I believe this is the mission that you will have enjoyed hearing more about in the last 2 days, with the even the earlier discussions that you will have had around the launch of the journal. And these are critical milestones in the development of that science ecosystem and partnership that we need. Just next week will be the Science Forum South Africa, which is also a localized but globalized activity that has become annual in the calendar of science engagement across the continent. The theme this year is looking at science diplomacy, and without going into too much detail, those who will be able to plug in will plug in. Those who are attending, Godspeed, because it will be a very important milestone activity. Over the years, this issue of science diplomacy has come into play. Where and how do scientists actually amplify their voice? Oftentimes, one of the criticisms to science and science foundations like SFA and others and the academies of sciences has been that we really talk to ourselves too much. We are so insulated or inward looking that we don't come up to talk to policy makers. I believe this is a fair and just criticism. And in the context of the topic I was given, it's important that we continue unpacking what is the role of not-for-profit organizations, including think tanks, intellectuals, thought leaders, academies, universities, and all other manners of tertiary education. But one can go even further. The entire education ecosystem, what is its role in ensuring that there's a broad understanding and an accountability mechanism that can be made so that all leadership across local, national, interstate, international organizations understand very thoroughly the importance of investing in science research across the world, because increasingly we also realize that our development problems are not going to be localized, they are globalized. For example, with COP28 coming up, I believe this week in Dubai, it's quite clear that most of the climate challenges that we are experiencing know no borders. The issue of air quality does not stop at any national border, it transcends national, regional. The increasing phenomena of adverse climatic events is affecting countries across different ecosystems and landscape, and oftentimes can have very devastating impacts across communities, especially, unfortunately, the most vulnerable communities are often affected. And these will be your indigenous communities living in rainforests with fire, exposure to fire, those who are living in dry, harsh environments, exposed to flooding, etc., etc. So what is it that collectively we can do? My belief is that with the real ongoing challenge of accessing science financing, mainly because of competing international global demands. As we all know, right now we're in the middle of, unfortunately, very deep and seemingly long drawn out conflicts which are not ending, especially on our continent. Therefore, the budgets for science, research, education will not necessarily increase overnight and unlikely to do so in the foreseeable future. So, what mechanisms are we using to ensure we can make do with less? My belief is that science diplomacy, going beyond borders in doing science, in securing partnerships for science, in securing collaborations for deep research that is being done for communities across national borders, is critical to ensure that we can realize the successes that are necessary to drive solutions for our developmental challenges. Again, going back to pandemics, with the HIV/AIDS pandemic, I was at the time privileged or lucky to be involved and engaged at a national and regional level. It became quite clear that if you are going to address, for example, I'll take a very a simple, not simple perhaps, but an example out of that pandemic. Long distance truck drivers who were mainly male, coming, say, from Cape Town, going to the DRC, traversing across many countries. Simple job of logistics and supply chain management, but became a huge vector in terms of the transmission of HIV, especially, unfortunately, to young girls. It could not be solved with national programming at national level. It needed a transnational or international, therefore regional perspective. If I look at Southern Africa, for example, and I suspect the same was the case in West Africa from the literature that I've seen, solutions were able to be gotten only when between the countries there was cooperation to ensure that addressing this cohort of service deliverers, males who were truck drivers going from country to country delivering most times very expensive goods like oil, petroleum, food, were given the opportunity to get access to, I'd say, dignified services for treatment of STIs, for rest, but also importantly, for social behavioral support. Because most of these were men who were far away from their families for days on end. And whether you criminalize sexual work, it was going to happen with or without, state intervention. So NGOs or NPOs were very critical in, for example, doing some of the uncomfortable work with stigmatized communities like sex workers, to ensure that they could get access to basic medical support, counseling services, basic empowerment programs like cash for young vulnerable women to take them out of sex work, and also for empowering households at community level so that girls who would otherwise be in the sex work industry were able to come out or stay out of that activity and go to school. So with the ripple effect of one programmatic intervention, solutions were gotten across countries, across borders, and as I say, the case studies are there for everyone to appreciate. So in other words, with future challenges coming, whether they're pandemics or they are development challenges like food security or health security or any other security issue, including, of course, human security in the form of conflict, it is critical that we look at these inter-regional solutions or problematizing of programmatic development towards solutions so that research itself becomes transboundary, transnational. And I think this is where, again, the positive is in respect to our institutions. Universities across the continent have become much more collaborative, much more agile. And again, perhaps that's one of the windfalls from the COVID pandemic. And they have enabled a lot better access to knowledge products that they produce. So going open source, for example, has enabled that many more communities of practice are able to access these resources of knowledge, to share, to galvanize new research, and to collaborate. I realize that my time is over. My moderator has not said to me, please stop. I think I should stop at some point, but please give me an indicator how many minutes I have before I ramble on. Moderator?
About 5 minutes, Prof. About
Okay,
5
thank
minutes.
you.
10 minutes.
Okay, great. So just going on, I think, so in just wrapping up, I'd say one of the other critical roles, therefore, of government beyond the enabling environment of financing, of developing the necessary human capabilities, of ensuring the infrastructure in terms of universities, laboratories, and so forth are available in country across regions, and also in ensuring that they become active actors in the regional and continental and global instruments like UNESCO, the African Union Commission, the national governments, will also be this issue now of science diplomacy, as I said, which is really about knowledge management and knowledge dissemination. And I've just mentioned earlier the critical importance of open source. As a scientist on the continent, one of the things that we still struggle with is this issue of ownership of knowledge products or information, even in terms of access to those resources in the first instance. Many young researchers, emerging scientists struggle to get published, which is a do or die for a scientist, to get their product to market, to commercial line, and also to global spaces in terms of now going on to the shelves is a product. Now, clearly, when you say to people, you need to go open source and start sharing openly or publicly your knowledge development, people cringe because it says, so what is left for me? What's in it for me? It's critical that at gathering like this, as ASFI has provided a platform, we critique very frankly and honestly this issue of intellectual property protection and also of knowledge sharing, open source being one of those tools. Because oftentimes it's a great misunderstanding. As a young scientist many years ago myself, I didn't generally know what it means to share. And I think with hindsight, had I known a lot more of what this means for me in terms of protecting my own knowledge, I would not have been as shy in sharing as I was, because I would have become of better value in terms of sharing my vague, basic ideas with others to accelerate development of those ideas to something bigger. So I think that's a plea in parting to say it's critical that as we consider the role of government, we also ensure that government develops those robust instruments for ensuring knowledge sharing, knowledge dissemination, knowledge transfer are in place. And this is where the big I is. Innovation happens where there's freedom of movement of people, of ideas, of products. And this is where perhaps the continent still fails us, in that the very tight legislative frameworks in place for the movement of people and their ideas has been a crippling factor in ensuring that Africa thrives in the area of science and technology, research development. We need to break down those boundaries and barriers that are inhibiting researchers who are already in consortia, for example, that are supported, for example, in the Science Foundation for Africa, to ensure that people are able to move very quickly, especially emerging scientists. If somebody is based in Zambia and needs to get to Niger, and then from there to Burkina Faso, and then to Egypt in the course of a week to do work that is critical and time-bound, we cannot be waiting 4 months for visas to be processed, only to be turned back at the border of X country because one bit of the paperwork is not there, despite everything being in place. These are the things that scientists need to begin to collaborate about, becoming amplified voices in addressing this issue of inhibitive instruments in our governance systems that prohibit or that inhibit the movement of people and their ideas. It's great that we have this virtual space. I can sit in my, office seat in Gaborone and speak and share. But if I have a young scientist who I'm supervising, as tends to happen often, who needs to be in Ghana, in wherever, and they cannot get visa, we are not actually then enabling. And these are some of the things that from a global perspective, we need to be learning those lessons. And there are case examples, for example, in Europe, the Erasmus project that enables this movement of scientists and people, and therefore is accelerating very fast the transference of knowledge and innovation and taking ideas to product, to commerce, to impact. So those are some of the things that I think are critical to ensure that our governments actually accelerate the rate of legislative reforms, especially where they inhibit or prohibit sometimes the free movement of ideas and of people. Secondly, and lastly, is this issue that our governments sometimes have these grand plans of long-term development, the national visions. Oftentimes, these are instruments that do not have implementation plans. So they're just, nice ideas out there, but there's nothing tangible. We as scientific communities need to ensure that our governments can be held to account for ensuring that our national visions actually have implementation plans that really specify where organizations like ASFI are going to fit in the grand scheme of things. Because only then can we get to 2030, 2036, 20, whatever year that we are envisioning in the future. And finally, the future of science, as I've just learned in Dubai, is not something we sit and discuss for 5 years. You take a long-term perspective. Dubai, where it is right now, was envisioned in 1970-21 by its founding leaders. They are where they are because of that gains made over that time. We, if we're anticipating the African continent, especially science, environment, and ecosystems to be where we want them to be in 2070, we need to do that now and make those imaginaries of science in Africa in 2070 real here and now. And I think with that, I'd like to thank you for your audience and say that thank you especially to Dr. Bright Nero and colleagues who have invited me to this forum before, to say, I really hope that my limited sharing has been of use. And to the audience, thank you for listening. Over to you, moderator.
Thank you very much, Professor, for the enriching keywords, keynote speech. And what we've learned is that if our government are enabling and they ensure that research are done in a regulatory way and they give place and they ensure resources, our science research will be moving forward. And for the government also to decentralize like legislation, policy planning, that will, if it is decentralized, it will be better. And then for the researchers, we have to come out and not talk to ourselves, talk to policymakers, and then plan now for our research to move forward, like in the 2017. So we start planning now as researchers. And thank you very much. If there's anyone with 1 to 2 burning questions, because we have short of time, we have like 2 minutes to leave here. Any hands? Any comments in the chat? Anyone with any comment? I see one comment. Thank you, Professor. Thank you so much, Professor Alinah, for such profound insight. Thank you a lot for great presentation. Thanks, Professor, for the insight. So thank you, everyone, for attending. Please let us give a round of applause to Professor Alinah once more. Thank you very much. And we have 1 minute to the next session, and the next session will be the breakout session. So we're going to the different rooms.
Can I just thank the
different
Prof
rooms
before she leaves?
Okay, thank you. Sorry.
Thank you, Prof. Alinah,
Please do.
for this very thought-provoking speech. It may seem quite complicated when you brought the ecosystem of actions, but that is really the way we need to go. We need to talk to each other across board to make this happen. So you have laid actually the issues bare. So colleagues, the onus is on us now to play our own part. You ended very fantastically to say that today is the time, not tomorrow. So whatever plans we have for the future, we have to start today. And for us at ASFI, we have taken the small steps, and we hope that we can look back in 10 years from now to say that these were actually giant steps we have taken. Thank you very much for always honoring our invite, and I believe that you will continue to do so. Yes, please have a very wonderful day.
Thank you very much. Have a great meeting further. Thank you.
Thank you.